these events are an opportunity for corporate curators to share the practices and interests of our members. And Val Ravaglia is a curator, displays an international art at Tate Modern, where she worked in this position since 2019, and before was an assistant curator between 2012, 2019. And she has worked on multiple displays and exhibitions at Tate Modern, contributed to the complete rehang of the collection between the opening of a new Tate Modern, the new building. So yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. And this short format has two parts. We'll start with a few kind of more informal, not so serious questions, and then we'll get into Val's practice in more detail. How does that sound? Yeah.
Sounds great. Let's go.
Perfect. All right. So the first question, the first kind of ABC question that I have is, if you could go for a coffee or tea with one of these artists, who would that be? A. Sol LeWitt, B. Donald Rodney, and C. Magdalena Abakanowicz.
Oof, it's tough. I think I go with Donald Rodney. There's something about his work which is so prescient for the time when he made it. And the way that he was interested in robotics and even data collection as early as the 1990s really speaks to me. And I can't help but thinking, you know, who knows what he would be up to today if he was able to live a longer life than the short 37, I think, years or so that he was able to grace us with his presence. Yeah, so Donald Rodney for sure.
Perfect, thank you. My other question is also quite something that probably can't happen, but if you could teleport yourself to see a past exhibition, which one would that be? A. Works by English pre-Raphaelite painters in 1912 at Tate Britain. B. This is Tomorrow, 1956 at Whitechapel Gallery. For those of you who don't know, This is Tomorrow was an exhibition that celebrated kind of new technologies at the time, media, with architects, designers, and artists taking part. And C. Henry Matisse, 1869-1954, a retrospective that took place in 1968 at South Bank, at Hayward Gallery. Yeah.
This one is much easier for me. Easily, This is Tomorrow. Besides the fact that it's an iconic exhibition, I'm really fascinated by that period of British art. And the show includes some of my favorite artists of all times, really. But there's also something about how, so the exhibition is most famous for its involvement, the involvement of the independent group and sort of, you know, Richard Hamilton's iconic works and Paul Otzi, Henderson, the Smithsons, sort of patio and pavilion section. But really, I'm quite curious if I really could go teleport back in time and see the exhibition to pay more attention to everything else that isn't so as well known as those sections of the show. Particularly the view, you know, of the British constructionists about how to reprogram the future in their sort of geometric abstract way that they were discussing. And then, of course, I am also quite interested in transdisciplinary transdisciplinary curating and really transdisciplinary practices at large. And that exhibition set itself the task of precisely seeing what happens when you get architects and artists and designers to work together on an exhibition design as well as the presentation of the works themselves. So it really was quite a groundbreaking concept for an exhibition of that kind in that period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the exhibition that Val was just talking about is This is Tomorrow from 1956 at Whitechapel Gallery. And I believe that the Whitechapel also can almost recreate it, used a similar concept to recreate this exhibition a couple of years ago with contemporary artists of our time. So
Yes.
please check it out if you're not familiar.
They've also reprinted the original catalog, which is great.
Yeah, we can recommend the catalog as well. Great. So the third question, last one in this part, is what is your favorite part of working on exhibitions? A, the research and artwork selection process, B, preparing interpretation materials, and C, installation or rehang.
Tough one. Can I respond to half and half of the options? I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. We can go 50-50 on this answer, yeah.
Good. Compromise. I like the research and artwork selection phase quite a lot. It's that phase of discovery and project building. That's probably what I find most fascinating and rewarding about the curatorial labor. The early stages of deep diving into an artistic practice, developing ways of communicating it and thinking about it sideways and in novel ways. But then there is also nothing quite like seeing the works installed, thinking about them spatially, in real physical spaces with people and materials. There's a kind of haptic knowledge that happens from installing the works that is not reproducible really in any other way except in the install phase. So there's something to be said for both of those for sure. But I think they take the cake 50-50.
Yeah, I guess this is a tricky question because each part, every kind of step of the way is valuable in its own way. But thank you for replying to this. So yeah, and now let's get more into your practice. Let's do a deep dive into your work. So as I mentioned at the beginning, you've worked at Tate Modern for quite a few years. First as an assistant curator and then now as a curator of displays and international art. And I wanted to ask you, I think it might be interesting to our audiences to hear about what was your journey to working at Tate, and what does the role involves? Kind of displays and international art. It's not as I think it's not as straightforward as it doesn't translate immediately to what you do. So, yeah, thanks.
Perhaps an intentionally vague job title. So I studied my BA in art history in Rome at La Sapienza, which actually was one of the first universities in Italy that had a curatorial curriculum. So I was lucky enough that I already decided quite early on in my academic career to go towards the curatorial side of things. And then I got a bursary to study curating at Goldsmiths. So once I realized that I was going to move to London, the very first thing I did was request an internship, apply for an internship at Tate Modern, which somehow I got. And so the very first thing I did on day 2 that I set foot in London was to do my induction at Tate Modern as an intern. And I got to work on some of the shows that would then, like even now, I would consider to be some of my favorites that I've ever seen at Tate. Duchamp and Ray Picabia was one of them, which really was like a fever dream come true to be the intern for a Duchamp and Ray Picabia exhibition. And the Cy Twombly retrospective as well, which reconnected me back to Rome because that exhibition then traveled back and I got to translate the catalog into Italian. It was good times. And then I was fortunate enough to get employed by Dulwich Picture Gallery as an assistant curator for their collection displays, which combined with my experience of having been at Tate as an intern, it was probably the perfect storm to prepare me for the job as assistant curator of displays that would then come up. It was a maternity cover at the start, and I was working closely with the then head of displays, Matthew Gale, on collection displays at Tate Modern. It had been there quite a long time now, for 10 years, and over the the period of time that I was assistant curators, I got to see for example, the first time that we opened the tanks as a space for performance and time-based media art. This was even before the new part of the building was built. And then as the assistant curator, I was involved in the rethinking of the collection displays for the opening of the new building, which was a time of rethinking the narratives underpinning the collection displays at Tate Modern. My role is primarily to solicit ideas and facilitate conversations about collection displays at Tate Modern. So I don't curate myself every single room or every single display. That would be quite the task. Though I do curate individual rooms or sections, self-contained parts of the collection displays. And I participate in those conversations, providing idea, providing suggestions. And because I've been there for a while and witnessed quite a lot of recent acquisitions into the collection, I do have a pretty good sense of what has not been shown yet, for example. So works that have been acquired but are on the wish list for works that need to go on display. So that's also a crucial part of my role, yeah. And occasionally I do other things. So I was the assistant curator for the SUPERFLEX Turbine Hall Commission, for example.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And you mentioned the rehang and the kind of opening of tanks before the new part of Tate opened. And I would like to ask you about your methodologies and while rearranging displays, and kind of what steps do you take to make sure that they are understandable, accessible to people? Because I think it's very interesting because you work with collections a lot with a certain kind of pool of artworks that are available for you to use as a curator. So that's very different from a lot of kind of the interviews that we've had before, where independent curators kind of source artwork themselves. So could you speak a little bit about your methodology in working?
Yeah, I do get to work with certain constraints, let's say. So like the work are, in a sense, the long list of works to select from is pre-selected for me because it's the works that are required for the collection, right? But there are so many that there's still quite a lot of freedom to select. Because of their thematic approach, displays at Tate Modern can really go in a number of different directions. And when in the run-up to 2016, we began to think about the rehang, it really is almost like a clean slate to start rethinking the curation of an entire set of collection displays from scratch. Where do you even start, when you have too many options? So for the 2016 rehang, we went through a lot of potential options for how to rehang it. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves precisely for that rehang that led up to the opening of the new building, knowing that the architecture was going to be quite peculiar in that the south part of the building, the new building, is connected to the old one, but it also feels a bit separate. It's only connected by certain bridges. And so in a sense, it has its own architectural identity. And many of our conversations were about whether the thematic narratives or there was going to be an overall curatorial conceit to bring the two closer together. And we ended up with a compromise solution in a certain sense. In that, because we were building on the basis of the tanks, which are spaces that Tate decided to dedicate to performance and time-based media and installation art, the bracketing of the art that would go in the new building was going to be from 1960s onwards, and telling the story of how art became active was the tagline for the new building. Whereas the existing part of the building was continuing to do what it already did, which was to tell the story of 20th century and 20th contemporary practices from more recent years. So for now, because the collection occupies such a vast expanse of space, it's quite helpful to divvy up the collection displays in with thematics that are self-contained, so the each one read like an exhibition, like collection-based exhibition, and visitors can choose to see, say, artisan society, media networks, and performer and participant, and then that they get a sense of completeness or incomplete completeness from the selections, the thematic selections that we've put forward for them around that theme. But there is no sense of needing to see every floor, every room, otherwise you miss out on a certain bit of art history. That is one of the advantages of thematic curation. But then on the other hand, there's the downside that you may, as a curator, find yourself restricting the reading of an artwork because you're pigeonholing it within one particular thematic display. Whereas if it's a multi-layered complex artwork that would fit in more than one display that we currently have on in the building, there's that risk of curtailing a little bit of. So personally, I think the best strategy is to layer the interpretation as much as possible. Although on the other hand, you also can't overload visitors with information, because we offer already so much art, and each of them coming with their own captions and wall text, that if you want to layer it in the gallery, it's going to potentially even be more confusing or detrimental. So something that I'm thinking about currently a lot is strategies to provide more information, but without overwhelming the visitors. And of course, I have the lack of working in at the time where that layering can happen online, and so we can potentially provide potentially a QR code to go and read more information about an artwork and explain what other ways of looking at it there are beyond the framing that we've intentionally given by inserting it in a certain display.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've touched upon something very important, kind of the complexity of presenting the collections and displays. And I think I really appreciated you saying that you're trying not to overwhelm the audiences. And I think it's difficult to highlight because there is so much complexity, I think, that goes into your work. Which might not be immediately noticeable to someone who visits Tate Modern, and is not familiar with this kind of backstage look that we're taking now. So thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned QR codes, so I'm going to kind of follow with my question relating to technology and one of the exhibitions you curated. And because apart from displays, you curated temporary exhibitions and also the Turbine Hall Commission, like you mentioned earlier. So I'd like you to ask you specifically about two projects. The first one being the Nam June Paik exhibition, massive retrospective of over, I think 200 works that happened in 2019. And as with Nam June Paik's artworks, they are often installation or presented in a very certain way. And could you tell us a bit about what was your curatorial process in this case, and how does working on such a major show, how do you work on that and with so many artworks, and how does working with older technology in media also go? Is it troublesome, or kind of what challenges do you as a curator encountered?
Oh yes, it was a very fun and very difficult show to work on, precisely because of the question of obsolete technologies. But the question of technologies changing over time was also at the core of the way that Nam June Paik understood the use of technology in art. So in a sense, that gave us permission to play with that aspect a little bit and thematize it a little bit. So the show, the Nam June Paik retrospective, was a collaboration with SF MoMA, and we work very closely with the estate of Nam June Paik as well, which is already giving us a sort of solid infrastructure, a solid basis to work from, starting from the works that are in the collections of Tate and SF MoMA, knowing that most of those works can be incorporated in the exhibition, and consulting with the estate to see if there are particularly works that maybe have not been seen in a long time. And in consultation with the estate, the curator of the exhibition, the curators of the exhibition, Rudolf Freiling from SF MoMA and Soo Kyung Lee at Tate, they decided to restage a work that had not been seen since 1993 called The Sistine Chapel. The last time that it was seen, it was in the Venice Biennale when Paik participated as representation for Germany. Weirdly, but he spent time in Germany, and that's why he was selected for the German pavilion. And that work was essentially, what remained of it was a very old, obsolete channel switcher, and 4 video tracks that were transferred to digital, and the memories examined of John Huffman, who used to be Paik's assistant and helped him install the work in Venice. And from with these remainders of that work, some grainy pictures and John's help, we had to essentially redesign it, adapt it to the space. Initially at Tate Modern, because the Tate Modern version was the first one that was restaged after 1993. There was so much involvement that requires specialist knowledge as well of how to deal with media from a range of times, that we had to hire audiovisual technicians, an external company of audiovisual technicians, even though Tate has its own team of incredibly prepared time-based media conservators and technicians, but we had to bring more from the outside as it wasn't going to be enough. Of course, many of the early works, especially from the early 60s, are no longer functional because they're either fragile or simply the technology is too obsolete for us to be able to even simulate it appropriately nowadays. But we still, so for example, Robot K 465 or the record Shish Kebab, which is that work where you can skip between records that are rotating around the same axis using the head of the turntable. Sadly, many of those really saying groundbreaking works were exhibited as static, but we still wanted to at least select some that could be regraded up to an extent. And so, for example, one that I was closely involved with was Random Access, which is a work that he made in the basement of this domestic space where he had his famous 1963 exhibition. That was a wall collage of magnetic tape. And again, with the head of the magnetic tape, you could play the strips of magnetic tape directly on the wall and create your own sort of remix and cut up sound piece. And so we did our best to recreate it as closely as possible to what it originally was in 1963 on the wall. Needless to say, cathode ray tube technology is basically disappearing. And so sourcing all of the, not only CRT monitors, but also CRT projectors that some of the works require, was not easy at all. And we basically had to scour the secondhand market to find as many CRT projectors and TVs we could find. And we even asked for assistance from a waste management center where they had like a backyard full of old TVs that were being rained on, most of which didn't work anymore either, but we managed to get 3 or 4 from that waste management facility working for the exhibition, which we used in TV Garden.
These, so just following up on that, so these media are kind of devices that that you kind of access from the your collection or Recipe Mama. So you kind of had part of these, and then the rest was sourced, like so kind of from wastelands or like secondhand. So what happens with them afterwards, with the ones you sourced?
With the recreations, I mean, we knew from the start that the exhibition was touring in Europe first because it went to the Stedelijk, and then SF Moment it went to the National Gallery of Singapore as well. But then another question comes up, which is that of sustainability and whether it makes sense to not only ship all of the artworks for that exhibition, but to include also equipment that is not classified as art, which besides the fact that it adds to the bulk of the shipment, it also falls under different legislation and taxation for crossing over borders. And so I think that the majority of the equipment of the TVs and projectors that we used that we were able to reuse, or the Stedelijk was able to reuse in Amsterdam. But then as the exhibition was transferred to a different continent, they had to source their own because it was just not feasible to send all of those components. And so it is one of those really involved exhibitions where you have to reconstruct some artworks almost from scratch every time it travels around.
Yeah, thank you very much for evaluating on this and the show. The next one kind of running quite late with time, so I'm gonna move on to the next question about another quite specific display. We're called A Year in Art, Australia 1992. The title, the year 1992, comes from the court ruling in Australia, which overturned terra nullius. Please correct me if this is pronounced wrongly, which means land belonging to no one. So the basis on which the British colonized Australian land. And you mentioned partnerships with SF MoMA earlier and the foundation. And this was a partnership with MCA in Sydney. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about this specific exhibition of Australian art and international collaboration?
So in this case, the collaboration is shared collection works. So they were, the core of the exhibition was a series of artworks that we co-acquired with the MCA in Sydney. And co-ownership makes it somewhat easier for institutions to share works that can exist in more than one place and to exchange them if they have a physical presence. There's a thought behind the principle for co-owning artworks, which is partly driven by a question of sustainability, and co-ownership is one such way of thinking about, practices, museum practices for collecting institutions looking forward to a more sustainable future. And the exhibition itself was the second in a series that look at a particular historical moment or event and uses these events as starting points to look at the artistic responses to their causes and consequences of those historical events. And this one will focus on the first case, the first legal case about land rights of native titles in Australia that was actually judged in favor of the claimants, in favor of ancestral connection to land. I almost said ownership, but it's quite important to understand that the concept of ownership that we have in British law or in Western law in general, it really is fundamentally from the type of connection to country that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have with their country. And it's astonishing to think that the first time that the doctrine of terra nullius, so the doctrine of we have landed on this land, pretended it's completely inhabited, even though there's very many people already here, just claim it for the ground and claim access to and use of the lands, taking it away from the people that have been here for millennia. It's astonishing that the first time that nonsensical law holding on to colonial principles was overturned was in 1992. It felt like a strong historical moment to talk about questions of land rights and native titles, yes, in Australia, but also as a sort of a way of reflecting about similar claims as they apply in other parts of the world as well. It's just a snippet of it. And the exhibition included works by artists with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent that connect to artistic traditions that are millennia old, but also transform over time. And it was very important for us to treat every artwork included in this exhibition as a contemporary work or a work of its time, partly as a homage to the Aboriginal principle of any-when. So rather than displaying Aboriginal art as if it's something ontologically or fundamentally different from other contemporary practices. I know we're running over time, so I'm trying to.
Yeah, can you just tell us what any-when is?
An idea of time that is this connected to every moment in time in the present, or connected the present to any moment in time. And so in terms of how you look at artistic practices, when you see a work by an artist that is alive today, it still carries with it ancestral thinking or artistic traditions from a range of periods of time. It doesn't come out of a void, but it's connected to a certain way of seeing the past, and it connects to the future as well. There'll be, I can't do justice to the concept of any-when in just a few words, I'm afraid.
No, but thank you very much for explaining it, for making it clear what it means. And yeah, we're running out of time, so yeah, it's really such a pleasure talking to you and kind of hearing you speak about your work with such passion and expertise. And so I would just like to finish on the last question. Would you like to share what you're currently working on? Can you share what you're working on currently?
Oh, with pleasure. So I've recently opened a collection display room with works by Bart and Yasmin Johanna, Indian and Bangladeshi artists, respectively. So this is a room within the existing performer and display at Tate Modern. And of October, Yasmin Jahannupur will be in her installation performing her work, Let Me Get You a Nice Cup of Tea, which is a work where she offers home-brewed and homegrown tea to visitors while having a one-to-one conversation about the consequences of British colonialism via the history of tea as a transcultural beverage. So if you happen to be in London or be able to visit London by the 30th, I hope you do get to sip a cup of tea with Yasmin.
Great, thank you. We'll include the name of the performance in again when I republish this this conversation on our page, which will be very shortly, probably tomorrow morning. Yeah, thank you very much for today's conversation, Val. It's been really great hearing from you. Right. And yeah, thank you everyone who joined as well. Yeah, we're hosting these CFC members quiz on Mondays, not every Monday, every now and then, but yeah, we'll have a few upcoming events of different kinds. But yeah, if you'd like to sign up for the membership, please go to the link in our profile and you'll get some access to new and perks that are not available to everyone publicly. So yeah, thank you very much, Val, and everyone else, and yeah, I hope you have a good evening or the rest of the day.
Thank you for having me and for listening.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone. We'll disconnect now. Bye bye.